Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Carefulist, the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Katie Christophic, founder of The Carefulist, and today we have Rachael Piltch-Loeb with us. She is a public health expert and author of the book, The Millennial Caregiver. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
I am really looking forward to this conversation because I have not yet had a conversation with someone officially on the
Mm.
show from a millennial caregiver perspective. And when I saw that you wrote this book, I was so excited because there are so many people who, think that millennials are 18 years old. And that is just not the case. There are million millennials who are in their late 30s and to turn 40. And so, of course, now that is prime time caregiving age. So, with all of that said, I would love for you to caregiving story.
Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned that about kind of millennials being perceived by as being kind of teenagers still. I think that we tend to think of ourselves that way. I have a younger sister who's verging on 30, and I think I still place her as significantly younger. So I think it's a mental age too. But
Yes.
yeah, thank you for that introduction and part of my caregiving experience was this fact that I felt too young to have an ailing parent. And I am the oldest of three. And my dad was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's when just before I was 30. I was in that phase of life where I was just starting to hit traditional milestones, if you can call them that. I'd gotten married. I was about to have my first child. I now have three children, and thinking about career development, thinking about home buying, all of that stuff, and not thinking about an ailing parent, frankly. And I think that
Right.
that's one of the things that struck me the most about caregiving and my mom's my siblings' experience with caregiving is you're never quite prepared to be struck or hit by the need to become a caregiver. And it really hits you like a ton of bricks. And I think what was challenging for me was that shift in expectations of what I could look to my parents for, to my dad, who had always been this kind of calming presence in our lives. He was a super um, present person, just in terms of being physically around when we were kids, and also emotionally available, there to talk, there to chat. And both of our parents were, and we were lucky to have had that relationship. But when he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, it really robbed him of his personality. It robbed him of his many of his physical abilities first. He kind of lost his sense of direction, his ability to do math, and he was a middle school math teacher. His ability to kind of calmly and rationally approach life, really. And that is one of the challenges, of course, with a cognitive issue as well, is just the shift in temperament and in function. And eventually it robbed him of many of his kind of physical abilities as well. And as our family kind of experienced that, it was difficult to know where to turn for resources. And I think resources, especially around how to balance being a caregiver and a younger adult, trying to continue on that trajectory of hitting some of these traditional milestones I was referring to before, while being kind of present and showing up for his needs and the needs of our family unit to support him. And when I couldn't really find a resource, either kind of from Dr. Google, as I like to call it, or in a book form, I sort of set out to create one. And that is the book that you were referring to, The Millennial Caregiver, which is really inspired by my experience as a caregiver and the experience of many others who I spoke to, who were in kind of a similar situation of being a younger adult while experiencing caregiving.
Yeah. I, oh gosh, this speaks to me so much. And I know I mentioned this when we talked before, but I had a very similar experience. And so my late 20s, I started noticing something was going on with my mom. And by my early 30s, I knew for sure
Yeah,
that we were dealing with dementia. And it was so lonely because none of my close friends, and not that you would wish your friends to
of
go
course.
through it, but none of my close friends understood from a parent child perspective. They understood from things their grandparents went through, but nobody else was dealing with an ailing parent and trying to raise young children and trying to have a career. So the fact that you saw all of this and wrote a book and packaged it all together is really fantastic because there are so many more people out there who are going through it than you realize. And finding that peer who really understands where you are at that point in your life, you're not someone who has kids in college.
Hmm.
Or, you're just a person in their 50s who has done the career path and you've made it to the C-suite, and now you're having to make different choices because you have aging or ailing parents. It's a different experience.
Yeah, I that resonates so much with me, and a couple of things really kind of come to mind. One is I always was struck when friends would ask, with the best of intentions, and I have wonderful friends, how are things going? And it is such a challenging question to answer because one, it's like, do you really want to know how
Right.
crappy, it is? And
Yeah.
it would almost take so much emotional and physical energy to kind of explain the details of a really challenging moment of caregiving and whatnot that it wasn't worth it. So I feel like I
Yep.
disconnected a little bit because I found it painful and challenging to articulate. And I also
Mhm.
had this challenge of not wanting to sound like I was talking poorly about somebody, my dad, who could not control what was
Yes.
happening, right? And I think that that's the other kind of challenge of caring for somebody and somebody who you love and respect and who has been there for you, that you don't want to kind of violate their autonomy and their sense of self. And yet, for
Yep.
you as a person, it is so deeply difficult sometimes to be in those moments
Yeah.
and you're looking for support. So I think that for people who are trying to be your support system, they have the best of intentions, but figuring out how to like balance those conversations is really hard. um and I think the other thing that you said that really resonates with me was this kind of notion of um making like time as you have young children, because I think for anybody who has young kids at home, even if your spouse is around or you have help with childcare, there seems like there's no hours in the day, at least for me. And maybe that's, I've,
Oh,
and so I think that this notion that you need to make more time and figure out how to compartmentalize different activities for a caregiving experience is really hard. And one of the, I think, wonderful things about parenting is that we see our kids evolve and grow and hopefully change like for the positive or and become little people. I
yeah.
always joke with parenting, it feels like you're just trying to put the guardrails on and support their temperament and personality and curiosities. But with
Mhm.
caregiving, you don't get that reward that things are going to improve or get better or evolve in a positive way. And that
Right.
makes it a slog sometimes. It makes it really
Yeah.
challenging and it makes it difficult to try and find time for that and like the emotional toll that takes while doing the caregiving of being a parent or the career oriented activities. And it seems like you are forced to multiply the number of hours in the day.
Yes. And the thing that I found, excuse me, particularly challenging as my kids were growing and doing the things they were supposed to be doing as little people, it was juxtaposed with my mom's decline.
Yeah.
So, when they started out, she could do more than they could. But then there was this trajectory where they were coming at one another and then they eclipsed one another. And the
Yeah.
kids were able to do more than she could. And to watch all of that and be rooting for your kids and happy that they're doing the things they're supposed to do, and then deeply grieving
Yeah.
what your parent can no longer do. it is really difficult to explain that to somebody else who hasn't
Absolutely.
lived it. Yeah.
Yeah, that I had a very, very similar experience. And one of the my kids were uh my kids, I had two kids by the time my dad passed away. My older son was 2.5 about, and my younger son was 8 months old
Mhm.
ish when my dad passed. And what the was fascinating and special was that my older child is actually so far still seems to have it's hard to call them memories because they're not articulated, but sentiments and positive feelings towards my dad. And, they would sit and kind of play music or giggle together, sit on the couch next to each other. And I think likely for my dad, who, would have trouble finding words, that comfort and like love that can be shared with a child that doesn't have judgment in the same way that I think
Yes.
adults have is really at least a silver lining or a positive kind of piece of joy that came from the experience. Like being able to have had the opportunity to watch that was fantastic. And so I as difficult as it was important to try and maintain some sense of interaction between the generations.
Yep.
But for me, then it was also really challenging to watch those interactions sometimes, and one, not feel comfortable leaving my dad alone with my kids, and
Mhm.
two, wish that he was able to be more of the person he was when I was little, because he was great with little kids, and long for that. So it's a double-edged sword when those things are happening.
Right. Yeah. I used to talk with my husband and siblings and things about how it was like watching a master class in nonverbal communication
Yeah, I love that.
when the older generation and the young ones would be together because they would still find ways, like you said, to interact and enjoy one another's company, but without much conversation.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it. And it's very much shared experience.
Yeah. I remember one time, my son is the youngest of all six of my parents' grandchildren. And I forget exactly what we were talking about, but it sort of came up about how my parents had not been to our house in a really long time. We live a couple hours away, and he didn't really remember the last time that they had visited. And so we were talking about that. And I said, she loves you. It's just hard for her to be able to talk. She doesn't have that ability anymore. And I will never forget he said this, and he was only like 5 at the time, and I was just so struck and so comforted by it at the same time. He said, "Oh, mommy, I know she loves me. I can tell by the way she smiles."
Oh, wow. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. So
That's
I
really
and
amazing.
it's like what you said. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily clear memories, but it's a sentiment,
Yeah.
it's an instinct and a feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. And it's nice that stuck with him even at such a young age.
Yeah. Yeah, and something else you said was really important, and it is really hard to know that they are missing out on the
Hmm.
person they were, and they won't know them in the
Yeah.
same way that you knew them. And being able to tell stories and share stories and things is really great. But when that's not what you thought was going to
Right.
happen, especially as a younger person, and this is something that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, when you as an individual are just now coming into being an adult and you're still learning how to be an adult in the world.
Yeah.
And then, you're having kids and now you also have to take care of a parent. Like that is jarring beyond.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's so funny because I remember talking to my mother-in-law right around the time that my dad passed away about how I just sort of really didn't feel ready for that to happen.
Mhm.
And I remember her saying, you're never ready, and you're never ready for these kind of transitions that shift your kind of sense of your own role in life, like. And I think that that there is some truth to that, and it speaks to what you're saying, which is like, I don't know when we feel like we become like an adult. I certainly, I have 3 children now. I certainly still don't feel like that. I feel like
Right.
I'm,
No, I don't
figuring it
either.
out as I go. And I think there's, so many folks have said this before, but I think that, you realize that when you were a kid, it seemed like your parents had it sort of figured out, but we're all just figuring it out as we go and seeking guidance and as we get there. And so I think that, part of this loss and this change of that comes with caregiving is that recognition that there is so much we don't know, and that there is such a challenge in trying to figure it out, while you're still trying to figure out the day to day of being like a parent and a professional and all that kind of comes with life. Um, and I think that if we are lucky enough to have positive relationships with our parents, which not everyone does, of course, the thought is like they'll be there to answer these questions, like
Right.
existential or
Yes.
minor.
Mhm.
And that kind of sense of that change, the fact that my dad is not there, um, and is a big loss. And it's a loss because um, of so much of how I pictured him being present in my own
Yes.
life and for my kids. And I think that there's a lot to unpack in that is comes with who he was as a person, kind of this stage of life, and then how that changes like the dynamic with the family members that are still around, how it shifts, my mom's needs and where she's gonna live and how she's gonna spend her time as an adult, how it shifts, my relationships with my siblings and similar, my brother had, for example, his first child, like after my dad passed away, and the fact that he'll kind of never meet him, and that like father son grandson connection won't
Yeah.
physically be there. So there's loss and change to process even as time continues to evolve. So I think that what's fascinating, sad, a lot to unpack about caregiving and loss and grief is just that it continues to evolve over time, just as
Yes.
we continue to evolve and try and figure out how to be an adult and a parent and all of this. So, that sense of change almost is constant, I think, when you're in a caregiving space and when you've been impacted by caregiving.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that is absolutely true. And,
Right.
you
It
know,
doesn't just stop like either when you're in the experience or after the person passes. There's still like a
right.
lot that is impacted down the road from having been in that situation. And
Yeah.
I think that, my dad passed away um, 2 years ago now. And it in some ways it feels like it's been a long time, and in some ways it feels like it's barely been any time.
Yes. And my mom also passed away about 2 years
Yeah.
ago. And you said something that really struck me. And it's, when the person passes, and especially depending on the diagnosis, it's coming, you're
Yeah,
expecting it, you prepare yourself as well as you can, and then it happens, and you're either as prepared as you thought or you're not. More often than not, you're not as prepared as you thought.
definitely.
And then there is like, that first year, and then you're getting through things, and so you're focused on, okay, well, this is sort of the grief I expected. And then there are moments that pop up that you did not expect to feel grief,
Yeah.
and they just kind of show up and smack you in the face. And I have a very recent example. My daughter is going to her first homecoming,
Mm.
and we were dress shopping.
Mhm.
And, it was fun for a while, and then we weren't finding one, and it wasn't fun. And then it got fun again. But as she was trying on a couple that she really loved, I was texting my siblings. But my first instinct, even though, my mom was sick for a long time and we never texted one another, my first instinct was to take a picture of her and send it to my mom and go, okay, she's having a tough time deciding between these two
Yeah.
dresses. Which one do you think? And, she ended up picking the one that I think my mom would have picked anyway, which I
Yeah.
did not tell her. But it was in that moment in the
Yeah.
Macy's, dressing room. She's behind the thing putting the dress on, and I'm standing there with my phone going, "Oh, I can't cry here."
Right, right, right.
Like,
Keep it in,
this
keep
is
it
a
in.
happy day. I need to
Yes.
pull it together.
No, it's so funny you say that. I had a very similar experience recently where my middle child was doing something and he was kind of just being goofy. And my sister and I often talk about the fact that he in particular, my dad would have gotten a kick out of him because he just has like a bit of a cheeky personality, like always a
Mhm.
little bit there, very classic middle child at the moment.
Yeah.
Um, and he was doing something to kind of poke his older brother, but bother him a little bit. And I just had this, I messaged my sister, I have this urge to send dad a video of this. He would have found this hilarious.
Yeah.
And my sister laughed and said, "Oh my gosh, totally." And it's funny because, you know, I have his number. He obviously doesn't send to him anymore, but I have a
Mhm.
history of texting with him and that urge is still there. And the other day,
Yeah.
I at this weird, like I woke up and I was like, oh, I haven't talked to him in a while. And it was like I was hazy. And it's like, of course I haven't. He died 2 years ago. But it's
Yeah.
like this like natural default that still comes up, like, oh,
Right.
I haven't called him. And so,
Yeah.
that those habits, that thought, it doesn't like go away easily. And I don't
No.
want it to either, right? So
Right.
there's like that delicate balance. And it's a little bit of like a curse because I have these voicemails from him when he was really unwell. And unfortunately, towards the end of his life, he had to move to a memory care facility because it wasn't safe for him to be at home anymore.
Hmm.
And he was only there for a very short time, but he would have these moments where he would call us and just kind of start spiraling. And I have these very, very long voicemails, and I cannot for the life of me delete them because it's kind of the last time that I have his voice.
Yeah.
And even though his speech was not quite there, I have voicemails from him wishing me a happy birthday going back something like 6 years because
Oh, wow.
um, that's kind of the last time he remembered when it was my birthday,
Yes.
right? So there are these little indicators, one of the changes that happened,
Yep.
and two of trying to hold on to the memory of who he was and a little bit of what happened over that period of time, because I think a lot of it also fades and we remember what we want to remember, but it was also a really challenging and painful experience, and you kind of recognize how much he was robbed of himself. And
Yeah.
a complicated constellation of factors, I think, when you're dealing
Yeah.
with cognitive decline. And it it doesn't change. It evolves over time, but it doesn't
Right.
change the fact that the loss occurred.
Yeah. I remember calling my mom because I used to call a lot.
Hmm.
Excuse me. I had a long commute home from work and I would check in every day.
Yeah.
And so, there got to be a point where my dad would have a picture and he would say, "Okay, I'll put her on." He would show her the picture and say, "This is who's talking to you."
Mm,
Worked for a little while and then it didn't. And that didn't really get to me so much
right.
because she couldn't see me.
Yep.
But I distinctly remember the first time, like, I went into their living room was right at the front door. So when you walk in the front door is the living room and like one of her favorite chairs, she would be in there. So walking in and going, "Hi, Mom," and having her look at me and not know, like I knew
Yeah.
she didn't know who I was. Um, that was really jarring. There's
Yeah.
something very disorienting about your parent not knowing you.
Yes. And what's funny with my, not funny, strange with my dad's condition was he actually, for the most part, recognized us. He couldn't necessarily
Mhm.
find our names, but he would recognize us. But he was, his verbal communication was pretty limited. So,
Mhm.
but I saw him, the last time I saw him was about um maybe a month before he died. It wasn't expected. He actually died when he did, which is, an interesting part of this disease, which is they can have a sense of the trajectory, but they also really can't. They
Oh,
meaning
for sure.
doctors. So I am based geographically in New York. My parents were living in the Boston area, so I would go up back and forth as much as I could. And I was there in late May,
Mhm.
and I had brought my younger son with me. And my dad was in the hospital, and so we went to visit, and he was sort of sitting there, and he saw me, and I turned the car seat around, this baby car seat, and he said, "Hi, little fella, you look like your mom." And it was so lucid and so
Yeah,
specific. And my mom was sitting in the room, and he then turned to her and said, "He looks like one of ours." And it was like he was saying, he looked like me as a baby, which he did.
yeah,
And my mom was, I think, just like in shock that he had, one,
yeah.
been so articulate, two, was making this connection, that it was clearly his grandchild,
Hmm.
and that he had, children with my mom, right? That, these were who all these people were. But he
Yeah,
couldn't have told you my name was Rachel and I was his, 30 whatever year old daughter. So it's
right.
this very, very striking moment and memory and kind of clear connection he made. And that's the last time I saw him alive. And it is kind of amazing that that's what
Yeah,
it was. And, I had that as my final kind of present memory of him. And so, as much as the disease kind of robs people of who they are, you really hold on to those moments when they are then able to reconnect, and you do
mhm.
wonder kind of what's going on underneath all the layers. That is the thing, baby and babies and kind of that connection to his earlier part of life that resonated. So
Yeah.
it was a really special, striking experience.
Wow. Well, I mean, what a gift. I always called those glimmers.
Yes,
Like
they
he
are.
would
They are
just show
the
up
small glimmers of hope.
out of nowhere and make sense. And then just as quickly as it came, it would
It's
disappear.
gone.
And it would be like,
Mhm.
wait, if I could just grab that for a second,
Yes.
but as you're processing, it's like, oh, I'm having a real conversation. It it would disappear. But I want to come back to something you said because I had the same experience, but in reverse with them, the doctors not knowing trajectory and things. So it sounds like yours went much faster
Hmm.
than you were expecting. My mom was put on hospice. And typically, when you're put on hospice, they expect you have 6 months or less.
Yeah.
And she lived 3.5 years.
Yeah. It's not a
So
ha
we
ha
were
funny,
thinking
but it's
she
like
was
a,
going to, we
yeah.
were thinking she was going to die any day.
Yeah.
And so we're like living on the edge of our seats for 3.5 years.
Yeah. Oh my gosh,
Like,
how exhausting. It's really
okay.
challenging.
And she also lost her ability to speak. And I think that's something that people weren't as aware of as,
Hmm.
a part of dementia. I think um, one of the blessings of the Bruce Willis story and
Hmm.
how open and willing they've been to share their experience, I think has helped to educate a lot more people
Yeah.
about that component of dementia. It's not always just forgetting who people are or where they are. They actually lose their ability to communicate in a lot of
Yeah.
cases.
I think that's right. I think a lot of the traditional portrayal of dementia or Alzheimer's is loss of memory, loss of sense of place in people. But like frontal temporal dementia, which my dad didn't have, but many of his symptoms were seemed a little bit similar, where he had some
Mhm.
personality changes and um, some changes in his kind of mood and verbal abilities, but he could still place us. So it was, not an expected constellation of symptoms, and I think we didn't really fully know what that would look like. So I totally agree with you. I think having more open conversations about the whole spectrum of dementia and the
Mhm.
ways in which it can look is really, really critical. As well as you know, I think, and I thought about this in the context of writing the book, and I know it's come up when you put together the resources for the Carefulest, but there are so many different things that come up when you're trying to support somebody who
Yeah,
has cognitive decline or who needs caregiving support, ranging from kind of legal considerations to financial considerations to how to navigate the many, many different doctors you have to see in the healthcare system to social support, medication management. You have to become an expert in a lot of different things because the brain is one organ, but my dad still had a heart condition from childhood we had to like look into. There was still like a general practitioner who was monitoring him, and there was lots of different stuff, and our medical system is not designed for care coordination, usually very
right.
effectively. Um, and so, there was a lot of navigation that had to happen. And, the medication stuff was a whole other factor. And then it kind of turns to this question of safety and where and what
Mm.
physical place can somebody be safe in. And so I think none of that is necessarily adequately understood or portrayed either. And you are unfortunately thrust into trying to navigate that while you're navigating kind of grief and loss and change as well. And that's hard. It is time consuming. It is expensive. Um, and it can, you think you're going down this one path, you've got to figure it out briefly, and then it can change really fast. And you've said it can feel like a lot of spinning wheels too.
Mhm.
And I think that can be really hard as well. So yeah, I think it's a challenging disease and role to try and articulate as we were even starting our conversation talking about.
Yeah. You used a word that I really love, especially when we're talking about dementia, and the word is constellation.
Mm,
Because there, if you think about space and the sky, there are tons of symptoms,
hmm
but not everyone has everything. So
Yeah.
somebody might have this over here in the northeastern part of the sky. Somebody might have two or three stars down in the, southwestern part. And then how does all of that come together and
Yeah.
work together to form what is now their new reality and subsequently their family's new reality?
Yes, I think that's right, and I think as advanced as our medical knowledge is, there's also a lot of kind of X factors. Why does one turn out this way and one person turn out another? And I think there's so much we're still discovering um, that it makes that expectation management part really, really hard.
Yes, it does. Yeah. And I think that's why you get the feedback from the doctors of, well, we can't really tell you,
Yeah,
this is just going to have to be new normal until something else changes and you adjust to the next new normal.
yeah,
New
absolutely.
normal is like my least favorite phrase on earth. I hate
Right, what is that?
it. That's a BS phrase for we don't know how to help you.
That's right. Exactly. Or get used to it until something else changes.
Right. Yeah, it's like I described it to somebody once as you're in this free fall with the
It's like a pause.
occasional
Yeah.
plateau. Or
Yes.
yeah, if you think about Looney Tunes, like Wile E. Coyote is falling and then they freeze him for a second and then he keeps dropping.
Yes.
That's what it's like.
Yes. I think that's
And it's
right.
not funny and it's not fun.
I completely agree.
So I want to flip the conversation a little bit to talk about your career,
Yeah, sure.
because that all plays a part into how you were able to write the book that you did. So why don't you tell folks what you do for a living and how that came about?
Yeah, of course. So I am a public health professor. My work traditionally has focused on how do we improve um, communication and support in public health emergencies, things like pandemics, hurricanes, big emergencies. And so I'm trained as a social scientist. I have a PhD and a master's, and a lot of that training is contributes to skills around how do you conduct research? How do you go about making sense of different data streams that are out there, pulling them together to try and answer a question? Um, and a lot of it is just, reasons to be in school. And so, and so, when I thought about my professional life and I thought about this problem that I was encountering in my personal life, it felt like a natural connection to sort of say, how can I think about this systematically? How can I try and answer some of the questions that I have about this? What does the data tell us about these different kind of topics that are kind of coming up for me as a caregiver, and how can I try and talk to others who have been in this situation and thread together their experiences and see if there are kind of some similarities that many people have had, and provide some guidance with around those topics. And that really is how I formed the outline of this book. I will say that I have done a lot of writing in the context of my professional life, but traditionally for an academic audience, or for students, for others who work in the public health space. And so
Mhm.
writing for a general audience, people like me and you who are caregivers, and we all have different educational backgrounds and perspectives, was
Yeah.
new. And so that was novel and intimidating, and a real new experience, but was really also a special experience to try and do that. So I basically took some of those professional skills and tried to apply them to this topic. And I do think that there is a lot of translation or parallel between, big emergencies that affect populations and these, what I would call this constant state of emergency, you're sort of in when you are in a caregiving role. And I found a lot of similarities in that experience.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I, we don't have to dive into it here, but what I find fascinating about caregiving and something that I don't think is talked about a whole lot is the existence of caregiving and emergencies that pop up
Yeah,
and when those things come together. So a hurricane is coming, the wildfires in California,
yeah,
and throughout, other parts of the West. When you are in charge of taking care of someone else and something like that is going to happen,
yeah,
what is the plan?
yeah.
And how do we handle it? Because right now we don't necessarily have an infrastructure that is built
No,
to
we have
handle.
such little infrastructure. It's such an important point. You know, I even you can think about it even going back to the pandemic. You can think about it in some of these weather events, but when you're a caregiver or when you're trying to support somebody, whether they're, especially if you're doing it from afar and you're not physically present with them, loss
Mhm.
of traditional kind of whatever structures you're used to in your normal, change to that is extremely difficult. Meaning, like, if your line of communication to your parents was cut off because you live far away, uh, you know, that could be devastating for them, for your mom, and for you, right? In terms of like your emotional well-being. And
Mhm.
so, and for them in terms of like, are they getting the care, the sort resources that they need? So I
Yeah.
think, there are efforts underway, to try and think about how telemedicine, telehealth, and community service organizations can help this, but it is not a problem that we have addressed sufficiently societally to think about people who are needing at-home care,
Mhm.
and people who are in caregiving roles, and what to do to support that when emergencies happen. Similarly, just in terms of like this notion of disruption, I think about it even for my dad. His official diagnosis was delayed because of the pandemic because routine procedures weren't happening, and a spinal tap to officially diagnose dementia wasn't happening. Now, that's I understand why, and I certainly understand why from a healthcare burden perspective. And yet, at the same time, the fact that he didn't have an official diagnosis, they also had to delay treatment because he didn't have an for certain conditions or
Right.
wouldn't prescribe certain medications because he didn't have an official diagnosis. And in his case, I'm not quite sure it would have made a particular difference, but for some people it might, right? Those 6 months to a year of not having intervention can make a real difference and
Yeah.
can have a big impact also on the financial burden that is associated with it if it's something insurance would cover with a diagnosis and not
Mhm.
without it. So when we think about disruptions physical to our infrastructure and where people are, as well as to our healthcare system, there's so many impacts that we're not really accounting for when we're coping or thinking about how people can cope with these disruptions. So besides, I can't echo the sentiment enough. I totally agree.
Yeah. So, when we're talking about your book and caregiving from a millennial perspective, is there a certain part of the book or a certain experience that you would like to share with the audience now, or something that you learned through that experience that you think is important or a highlight? Like, hey, you should read the book and find out more about this.
Yeah, no, I mean, the goal of the book is really so that you can pick it up and say, okay, I'm struggling or I'm thinking about this. Is there a chapter in here to help me? And
Mhm.
each chapter is structured so there is a narrative, somebody's story, whether it's mine or somebody I spoke with, and then kind of some nuts and bolts about what to do.
Mhm.
One of so everything from how do you navigate career and caregiving, how do you navigate social relationships with friends, with your spouse if or your partner if you have one, with your kids, um, thinking about grief and this notion of anticipatory grief, so grieving while somebody's living, which I think is
Yep.
something we really don't talk about, or I was completely unfamiliar with until I was in that space.
Same.
But one chapter I feel like is a little bit maybe of a surprise is this notion of how do we navigate complicated conversations with our family, like with the person who's diagnosed, with our siblings, with our other parent. And that is a topic I'm not sure I have all the answers, but I actually think is critical to place within all these other nuts and
Yeah.
bolts um, chapters because you're not going to have a good decision on who's somebody's healthcare proxy if you are having trouble like talking to your own sibling about what to do for your mom. And so I think that
Right.
it's important to think about the kind of foundational interpersonal dynamics that are going to impact that caregiving dynamic as well.
Right.
Um, and I think that the biggest takeaway for me, and this is a little bit tangential to what you asked, but is address some of these more difficult things as early as possible.
Yes.
Because it doesn't get easier as the person declines or as your
Right.
family gets into the experience. And the person who is ailing is going to be most able to contribute to their own decision making the earlier you have those tough conversations. And it stinks.
Yep.
But we had a good sense of what my dad's wishes were, and we held on to that as much as we could as we made decisions about as he progressed.
Yeah, that is such an important point, and I'm glad that you brought it up because yes, having that conversation early and continuing to have the conversation and make sure everybody is still on the same page, or, making sure that it's documented so that you can go back and say, okay, well, this is what everybody agreed on. Here it is in this, the five wishes. If you haven't heard of that, it's a free thing that you can
Yeah.
download. And it has lots of prompts about, yes, I would like this. No, I would not like that, whatever. And, the really, truly best time to have that conversation is before there's a diagnosis.
Yeah.
But as we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, most of the time it doesn't happen until you're in the crisis mode
Yeah.
of we've got a diagnosis, somebody fell, whatever the situation may be.
And I'm so glad you mentioned that there's kind of, and everything that you're doing is about kind of bringing together resources. Because I think that one of the things that really differentiates millennials versus other generations is this notion that we have, we're tech native, so to speak. We've grown up with technology.
Yeah.
And so there is a little bit of a shifting expectation that you can find an answer online. And I think because it has tended to be older generations who are navigating the healthcare system more and
Mhm.
who have experienced cognitive decline more, there's actually not a lot of online content that is
No,
tailored for
there's not.
caregivers. And there's not a lot of resources yet that are actually super helpful for caregivers. I'm familiar with a few that are evolving, and there's a gap. And I think that there's tech solutions that can help, with certain components of caregiving, medication management, calendars, etc. But I don't think we yet have a one size fits all. I'm familiar with a few that are trying to do that,
Mhm.
tender care or ionic care, but it's not there yet, I think, or
Yeah.
not in a mass distribution way. Um, and I think it's important to recognize that, like, there's tech solutions to micro problems, but it's not going to solve the big problem.
Right. Yes. And yeah, there is that definite disparity where you have the older folks who've been navigating the system, and there was a time when, okay, the doctor said to do this, and they're my primary care, and they're going to coordinate all of the things. They kind of don't coordinate all of the things anymore. Like, it's really your responsibility to update them on all the people that you've seen. And you are now telling them the full story of what's happening. And so that former, I don't want to say old, but that former version of showing up and the healthcare system is the one that's responsible for your information and your health story. It's fragmented, like we
Yeah,
talked about. There's specialists for everything. They don't communicate. So it is now completely on you. And that has translated to the caregiver experience of, well, I am now the coordinator of all of this. And there is no one place for me to go and figure this out with, zero medical training,
right,
with, maybe like my career was in pharma. So I have exposure to a lot of the terms and things in terms of diseases and specialties and all of that. There's, all of these layers to physical therapy and occupational therapy and all of those other things that I've never had exposure to.
right.
And the whole reason the Careful List exists is because I didn't know the word adaptive when I was looking for clothing that was easy to, help
Yeah.
my mom get dressed.
It's so funny, like a similar anecdote to that, but somebody recently sent me like a Skechers advertisement where to track your kids, you can put air tags in their shoes. And I was like, well, they should have just looked at dementia content because they have those sneakers for
Uh-huh.
adults, right? Like
Yeah.
you're like late to the party, Skechers, right? And so, but that was like a rabbit hole of like, my dad had wandered off. We were trying to figure out what we could do to prevent that. And anyway, and he didn't have his phone or his wallet, and we are trying to, anyway, we did try the
Right.
kind of tracker in the shoe at one point in time, but the point being, like, you become like a very random specialized expert in certain things like clothes and shoes and whatnot because you have
Yeah.
to, not because
Right.
somebody has told you about it usually.
Right. Yeah. You are expected to be the one to just figure it out.
Hmm.
Um, and not everybody has the time.
No.
Most people, I would argue, do not. And then it's back to that point that you made earlier, there just aren't enough hours in the day,
Yeah.
especially when you are a younger caregiver and you have children at home and you have a career. And it's not even, let's put career aspirations to the side of what you had hoped for your
Right.
career. It's a means of supporting your family
Yes.
and being able to, in a lot of cases, also support the person that you're caring for because it's
Yes,
expensive.
it is.
And there are a lot of folks who are not financially prepared.
No. And I think, unfortunately, there is not a lot of incentive in our system to change how expensive that is, how
Oh,
expensive long-term
100%.
care is, and the ways in which we spend money towards the end of life in terms of the healthcare system. We could go into probably a whole conversation of hours talking about that, but for now, it is simply cost prohibitive to do so much of what we would hope to do for somebody, unless you are making other sacrifices, whether it's in your time or it's monetary, or it's in the environment that the person you care for needs to be in. And so it's a really challenging, I think, moment where you are faced with life-altering potential decisions, whether it's making changes to your career. People mortgage their home, they spend money in kind of ways because
Yep.
there doesn't seem to be alternatives. And so, that is a whole other kind of structure that is really, really challenging to deal with and navigate while you're dealing with the emotional and the physical challenges, demands that
Mhm.
caregiving requires.
Yeah. And that taps into this idea of generational wealth.
Yeah.
And I was reading, I don't remember where, so I'm sorry, I'm not citing my source, but I was reading somewhere that someone was talking about how um, they, as a younger caregiver to their parents, are footing a lot of the bills for their parents because their parents had drained their 401k caring for their parents. So, like, they lost their retirement
Mm-hmm.
pay for the generation ahead. So instead of general generational wealth flowing down, top
Yep.
down, we are now funneling
Pulling
money
up.
up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is likely to continue, unfortunately,
Yep.
because that's the way the system is designed at the moment.
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's not easy, not easy to navigate. And I think it also goes with this expectation question, which is, okay, if you knew you were spending all this money and it was going to result in somehow a better outcome, whether that's a better quality of life or prolonged life, whatever kind of a better outcome means to you, that's one thing. But sometimes you
Mhm.
can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, really, and the situation is unchanged, right?
Yes.
Um, and that's what is so, I think, stark about this experience. And maybe it's not hundreds of thousands, but it's a lot of money.
A lot.
Um, and it's hard to plan. Okay, you plan for hospice for 6 months. If it goes for 3.5 years, that's a very different question and
Yeah.
expenditure depending on what's out of pocket and what's covered by insurance and whatnot. And
Mhm.
so the point being, it can be difficult to plan in the way you want to. And I think that if there is nothing more to take away from this conversation, just this notion of expectation management and lack thereof when you're
Yeah.
in a caregiving role is so difficult, so challenging.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this episode today. And if you would like to get a copy of The Millennial Caregiver, you can find it on our site at carefulist.com. And until next time, take care.